Hjärtligt välkomna tillbaka till MR-dagarna. Vi inleder nu dag 2 av MR-dagarna och vi hade en fullspäckad dag igår där vi pratade om demokrati och demokratins utmaningar. Och idag fortsätter vi på samma tema. Men innan vi gör det så vill jag uppmuntra alla till att ta hänsyn till varandra, ta hand om varandra, nys inte rakt ut, hosta inte i varandras ansikten. Vid minsta lilla känning, om du känner dig lite krasslig, överväg att stanna hemma just bara för att säkerställa allas säkerhet. Annars så är vi jätteglada att ses igen och jag tänker att vi sätter igång dag 2. Och det gör vi med den här panelen som vi ser bakom mig under titel Why are human rights needed in a democracy? Och jag lämnar över ordet till Linde Lindqvist.
Okay, so good morning everyone and welcome to this panel discussion on the question of why human rights are needed in a democracy. And my name is Linde Lindqvist. I'm an associate professor of human rights at the University College in Stockholm. That is Enskilda Högskolan in Stockholm. So we organized this part of the event together with the study association Bilda. And I would like to just send a warm thanks to Magnus Sundell, who's been an amazing companion in the process of facilitating this event. And I also would like to thank Tiana Berzelius at the University College Stockholm and Tamsin Jordin at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, as well as all the organizers, technicians, sign language interpreters, and other people here at the Swedish Forum for Human Rights. So without you, none of this could have happened. So last autumn, we at the University College in Stockholm started an international master's program in human rights and democracy. And one of the questions that we grapple with in that program is whether it's ever possible to have human rights without democracy, and vice versa, whether it's possible to have democracy without human rights. And to many of us working in this field, this may seem like an absurd proposition. Of course, you can't have human rights without democracy, and you can't have democracy without human rights. Yet there are all too many examples, past and present, of individuals and organizations, movements, political parties and states who have claimed otherwise. On a global level, we can think of countries like China, who are openly suggesting that a liberal democratic system is but one way of realizing human rights. And then they also think of their own one-party system as more democratic, actually, more attuned to the needs and wishes of the people than the kind of Western-style representative democracy. So on a global level, this notion that human rights and democracy are a perfect couple, so to speak, is under increasing pressure. And even in Western countries like France and Britain and Sweden, we see how politicians and organizations, intellectuals, are becoming ever more vocal in their critique of human rights, often claiming that human rights are incompatible with democracy, understood as the rule of the people, popular sovereignty. So I think it's essential that we see that this relationship between human rights and democracy is a very fragile one. It's one that needs to be defended. And as activists, practitioners, and students and scholars, we need to constantly remind ourselves and others why you cannot have one without the other, why you cannot have human rights without democracy and vice versa. So we need to see that human rights are essential for democracy, both as a kind of political system and perhaps more crucially, I think, as a way of life. So in this panel, we are joined by 3 very prominent panelists who can help us with this job, not just of explaining why human rights are so essential for democratic life, but also what that insight actually means for what we should pay attention to in our social and political activism, and what it demands of us as individuals, both as private persons, but also in the roles that we occupy at the moment and perhaps also in the future. So we're deeply honored to have Paul Hunt with us. Good evening, Paul. Paul is in New Zealand, and he is a man who requires very little in terms of introduction. He's the New Zealand Chief Human Rights Commissioner since 2019. He has written extensively on civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and has, among other things, served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health. So in just a couple of minutes, I will hand the mic to Paul, who will kick us off with some remarks from his part. And then we'll hear responses from two very special guests who are here on stage with me in Gothenburg. We have Henry Asher, who is a kind of local hero here, I would say, pediatrician and professor of public health, who's written extensively on children's rights, migration, and human rights, the human right to health, especially, I would say. We have Helen Lindberg, who's a political scientist at Uppsala University, who's, in my opinion at least, one of the most versatile thinkers we have on democratic political theory, and especially the role of civil servants for the practice of upholding and promoting the values that we associate with human rights and democracy. So after their responses, we will take questions and comments from people in the room. So you have to just raise your hand, and then one of the volunteers will come with a mic. So be prepare questions, but keep them brief and succinct, so we can hear as many as possible. So with no further notice, I would just like to give the floor to Paul Hunt, and I hope that you can all give him a very warm applaud that he can hear all the way to New Zealand. So.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so very much for inviting me. Many thanks to all of you for taking the time and trouble to attend. It's a pleasure to be with the panelists. Henry, just described as a local hero. He's a global hero, actually, and an old friend of mine. And Helen, it's my pleasure to meet you. And Linda, thank you very much for chairing and facilitating. I'm just going to make a few short remarks. I want to briefly convey a few short ideas. Some may be new to you, and some I'm sure will be familiar. The first brief set of remarks is about values, actually. Human rights embody a set of values. And these values include issues of fairness and decency and well-being and equality and freedom and belonging, community, accountability. We could go on, but deeply in the DNA of human rights is a set of values. Now, values, of course, evolve over time, just as cultures evolve over time. So this means human rights are not static. They too evolve over time. And this sometimes makes human rights very elusive and complex and contested, but it also makes human rights current and rich and dynamic. The second set of remarks I want to make is the importance of a holistic understanding of human rights. And by that, I mean human rights encompass civil and political rights, for instance, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, prohibition against torture. But human rights with civil and political rights, they include workers' rights, they include social rights such as the right to health care, the right to health protection, the right to education, the right to a decent home. But in addition, human rights have to be understood in this holistic way as civil and political rights, workers' rights, social rights, also cultural rights, also the right to a safe environment, also indigenous people's rights. So here in Aotearoa, here in New Zealand, a really important component of human rights are the rights of what we call tangata whenua, the rights of the Maori people. And in Sweden, of course, the Sami people. So human rights have to be understood in this broad way, holistic way, and not confined to a narrow set of civil and political rights. Now, this larger vision of human rights, I've not made it up. It was made up in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights shortly after the end of the Second World War. But I think we lost sight of this holistic vision of human rights, and it needs to be reclaimed. So on the screen, I think you can see a cartoon, which I'd like to look at briefly now with you. And the story behind the cartoon is that a year or so ago, I wrote an article in a New Zealand newspaper when I argued that human rights have to be understood as the 3 R's, namely relationships, responsibilities, and rights. And one of the newspaper's journalists read the article, and she kindly turned it into this cartoon, which the newspaper published. And if you just have a look briefly, she calls it, the cartoon calls it in the garden of human rights. So there are relationships, building relationships, as she puts it, between individuals, between communities. With understanding, there often comes acceptance. So one component of human rights is harmonious relationships within communities and between communities. Now, the second R, the first R, relationships, the second R is responsibilities. So here, as it's expressed in the cartoon, we have responsibilities to each other, like when we maintain physical distance if we are sick, or we pay our fair share towards maintaining our society and environment. Responsibilities not to be racist, not to be misogynist, not to be Islamophobic, not to be anti-Semitic. We have responsibilities as individuals to respect human rights. Now, classically, human rights are understood as placing responsibilities on the state. And that's very important. The state has human rights responsibilities, but in this conception of human rights, actually, individuals also have responsibilities arising from human rights. Now, I have to say that when I worked in the UN, I always refused to make that argument that individuals have human rights responsibilities, because frankly, I was always scared that authoritarian regimes would use this in order to reinforce disadvantage in their societies. So it's an idea that I think has to be treated with caution, but I think in a country like New Zealand, we can talk about human rights consisting of relationships and also responsibilities of individuals to each other. And you'll have to decide whether Sweden can count human rights in this way as well. That's a matter for you, not for me. And then the third panel is rights. And there we have the holistic vision of human rights: civil, political, workers' rights, social and cultural rights, to a safe environment. Each and every one of us deserves the right to thrive. So that's the sort of second group of remarks that I wish to make. Human rights, in my humble opinion, need to be understood as building harmonious relationships, government responsibilities, but also individuals' responsibilities, also the responsibilities of corporations, but also human rights do include entitlements and this broad understanding of human rights. The third set of remarks that I wish to make is this. I'm just checking my timing here. Is this. Look, I'm a lawyer, and I have to say, lawyers have appropriated human rights. I speak as a human rights lawyer. Human rights implementation began to be, human rights implementation was often understood about as it's for going to court and winning a case. That was seen as implementation by the lawyers. And the lawyers saw human rights as accountability, which is very important, but also judicial accountability. So this, it seems to me, is a very narrow understanding of human rights. It's a very narrow understanding of implementation. It's a very narrow understanding of accountability. Implementation of human rights is not simply about winning a case in court. It's about making human rights real in the everyday lives of everybody. So if you understand human rights implementation in that way, then one understands that real life implementation cannot be realized by lawyers alone. If we're really interested in operationalizing, making real human rights for people's everyday lives, then lawyers can't do that. You have to engage with health professionals and educationalists and environmentalists and town planners and family planners. It needs a different approach to human rights, not just through the law courts, but through health clinics, through public health, through schools, through universities, through housing estates, and so forth. And again, the lawyers alone can't do that. So the great challenge is to translate human rights into practical, operational initiatives. My fourth set of remarks are these, and now I begin to turn to democracy. Thriving democracy, as we all know, needs a set of checks and balances. Checks and balances between the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. But not only those three, democracy, a thriving democracy, also depends a lot upon not just the executive, not just the legislature, not just the judiciary, but also on a robust public service. It also requires a strong, independent media. It also requires a dynamic civil society. Those are all components of a thriving democracy: executive, legislature, judiciary, public service, a strong media, dynamic civil society. And this is where I want to add something which is rarely written and rarely said, and I'm beginning to say it and write it in recent years. And maybe people will say this is just commonplace, that's fine. Or maybe they'll say it's mistaken, that's fine too. We can talk about it. But what I want to add is what I call integrity agencies. Integrity agencies. It sounds a little bit pompous, but I don't have a better phrase yet. By integrity agencies, I mean agencies that are established by one arm of the state or another, but once established, have a degree of independence. And often they are the protectors and the champions of human rights. And they are things like, at least in New Zealand, the Children's Rights Commission. They include, in this country, in New Zealand, and many others, these integrity agencies include the Privacy Commissioner. They include the Ombudsman, about which you know more than I do. And they also include national human rights institutions. National human rights institutions with, in my view, national human rights institutions should have this broad vision of human rights that I talked about earlier. Civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, the right to a safe environment, indigenous people's rights. And the 3 R's conception of human rights: rights, responsibilities, and building harmonious relationships. And it seems to me that these integrity agencies are beginning to develop a quasi-constitutional status. And it's not yet been, their status hasn't yet been properly theorized, explicated, understood, but it seems to me they do play a really important role in a democracy. These integrity agencies have a role to play in advancing and protecting the human rights of everybody. So let me close with my last set of remarks, checking again my stopwatch. And I'll just close briefly with these remarks and turning to democracy. Look, human rights are designed to stop the abuse of power. We expect dictators to abuse their power. Their abuse is often very, very visible. Demonstrators get beaten up in a dictatorship. Newspapers are closed in a dictatorship. Trade unionists are imprisoned in a dictatorship. Sometimes democracies are also guilty of misconduct. And as some of you will know, and as I once said in Sweden some 15 years ago, a famous commentator once warned against the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. Now, curiously, when a democracy is guilty of misconduct, the abuse is sometimes more difficult to see than when a dictatorship abuses its power. The real impact of the tyranny of the majority is often masked, it's often disguised. There may be no summary executions, no torture victims, no imprisoned journalists. The misconduct, the abuse of power is often, in a democracy, somewhat elusive. It's often hidden. I don't mean by that there's a conscious cover-up, but in a democracy, misconduct is often obscured by subtle legal arguments, by compelling political justifications. And often when there is this misconduct in democracy, often there's a hint of populism. And in a democracy, those most affected by misconduct are usually not articulate journalists. Those most affected by misconduct in a democracy are not well-organized trade unionists or large numbers of noisy demonstrators. In a democracy, those most affected by the abuse of democratic power, they're usually the most disadvantaged members of society. Members of society who are often barely visible, and sometimes they are unpopular members of society. So it seems to me is the historic role of human rights in a thriving democracy to expose, to challenge the abuse of power wherever it occurs, whatever form it takes, whether the abuse is at the hands of a dictator or whether the abuse is at the hands of a democracy, whether it's accidental or whether it's deliberate. For those affected are popular or unpopular, whether those affected are visible or hidden. So this, in closing, is my view that human rights need democracy, democracy need human rights, and if are to avert the tyranny of the majority, we need human rights, and we need these independent integrity agencies which are champions of the human rights of everybody. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was an excellent opening to this panel. I would now like to hand the mic to Henry, so who will offer his response to what you just said.
Well, it's really difficult to come after you, Paul, because you really emphasize the very need of human rights in addition to democracy. But I would like to go back in history and look at what we need to learn from history also. If we look at the preamble of the Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, it says that this declaration is formulated to the background of the experience of what humans have been able to do and what they have suffered from the experience of the Nazi era, the Second World War, the Holocaust. And I think the formulation of the modern formulation of human rights is really has that background. They were formulated in order to prevent forever that something like that should be possible to occur again. That's why we have formulated the modern version of human rights. And what can we learn from this? Well, I think we need to remind ourselves that Hitler came into power not through a military coup, but through a democratic election. He was elected a leader for Germany. He abolished democracy rather rapidly, but if he had not done that, it would perhaps have been possible to make a democratic majority decision of the annihilation of the Jewish people from Europe. Would that have been okay? Would that have been acceptable? It would have been a democratic decision. Would it be acceptable? No, of course not. Because, and that's the reason why we have human rights, to point out that some things are not acceptable, even if there is a majority decision behind that. I think also it's interesting to be aware of that Nazi Germany had a fantastic research law, a research ethic law. It was put in place in 1930, and the background was a vaccination experiment. I think it was parotitis vaccination experiment that turned out to be a disaster. Lots of children died out from that experiment. And in 1930, it was formulated a law in Germany about research ethics with informed consent and all these things that now today are very modern in research ethics. This law was in place during the whole Nazi era. How could that be? We know all of, every one of us know about the horrible experiments that were done during the Nazi period. Well, this law was just valid for German citizens, not for the others. And I think that is very interesting. Today we often discuss about democracy, but we stop often the discussion when we mention the word democracy. We finish the discussion there. We don't discuss what do we mean, what is democracy, and we don't discuss the importance of human rights for democracy, because democracy seems to be enough as soon as we mention the word. But what happens with the others? That's, I think, an important question to raise. Today, I think in Sweden at least, we start hearing questioning the value of human rights, and some voices are heard that citizens' rights are more important than human rights, for example. But I think if we go back to history to try to learn something again, we don't need only to look at such horrible regimes as the Nazi regime. We can look at the black chapters in the Swedish history. We have definitely black chapters. We have the treatment of minority populations, Samis, Roma people, Jews in Sweden. We have the forced sterilization program. We have the Vipeholms experiments on mentally retarded people, where we proved for the world in so-called research experiments that sugar was an important factor for caries. Very unhuman experiments. These black chapters in Swedish history did not take place in a dictatorship. It took place in a democracy. And not just a democracy, it was during the people's homes era, where there should be no privileged and no stepchild. Everyone should be treated well. And still it happened. And I mean, it was possible to happen because of the lack of a human rights discussion. Because it didn't happen to us, to you and me. It happened to the others, those who are not like you and me. And I think also we can look at more recent events in Sweden. I think everyone has some ideas about recent events that perhaps the future generation will ask us, how could you let this happen? These were black chapters in Sweden's history, and they took place during democracy. And I think this is why we need to keep, not accept just democracy, not to stop the discussion when we say that we live in a democracy. We also have to always have the human rights discussion alive and critical and operational, as Paul mentions. And it's not enough with a democracy without human rights and lively human rights discussion.
Right, wonderful. Thank you, Henry. Helen.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul, for your excellent comments here, opening comments. I, of course, agree with you on many of those things, but I also have some, should we say, just like comments or questions on your 4 themes as you lay them out. And I just want to, the first theme about the values, and I agree with you there that human rights are, of course, based on values, but we also should remember, and I think Henry is also pointing to that in his comments, that each of those values are, of course, contested, and each of those values are also understood in many different ways. So, by different individuals with different ideologies and agendas. So that is one thing that complicates it from the start. And then I also reacted a bit on your metaphor you used on describing human rights. You say it's in the DNA of human rights, and you also say human rights, it's a garden, and all of that points to something that is organic, something that is living, something. And for me, when someone says that, it also implies that something is natural, that something is just what it is. And I think that is a kind of assumption that we really need to contest, because that can also hide or imply understandings that are really not shared by all or seem natural. Because as Henry also said, that there are many things in history that have been seen as natural, but of course are not. It's just power dynamics in that. So I think we should be careful in using organic metaphors for human rights. But that is me as a political scientist. I like contracts and things like that, you know. And the third point you made, or the theme here, is about the implementation. And yes, I also agree with you there, but I also want to point to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1958, 10 years after the declaration, she got questioned, and all of them in this committee were like question about the impact of human rights declaration, because clearly we had the declaration, but nothing much had happened in the world, right? So they got the question, how can we do this? How can we implement this better? And she also talks about what you put forth here, that we have to make human rights real. And she said in an article at that time that, yes, it starts here with you and me. It's in your hands. The text also says it's in your hands. So I agree with you, and I think Roosevelt saw this early on too, when it comes to the implementation. And there also, I want to be a bit like more cautious or hesitant about those 3 R's. I really like them and the way you put it here, but it tends to obfuscate or confuse who is the bearer of the right and who is supposed to implement the right. And we could say that, yes, we have responsibilities, but I think to me it's helpful at least to distinguish between what is a prerequisite for a right. Is this what I see your 3 R's, or at least the 2 first R's, really ask for are virtues among citizens. And this is a classical, to me, in political theory, Republican point of view or political philosophy, that a functioning political community needs virtuous citizens that can act towards each other in a manner that we can uphold a rule of law and decency and all this. But rights, to me, are still something else. That is something that is in the Constitution, and the state is supposed to implement it for us citizens. But there I'm sure we can have long discussions about that, but that is my just remark on that. And then the 4th point you made about democracy and the relation with human rights here. And you mentioned this idea you have of integrity agencies. And I actually wrote a piece that I want to take your argument a bit further. And I talk about, or what I've written about, you can talk about it as integrity agents. That is, each public servant has a kind of public or commitment to a public ethos, which in times can actually conflict or conflict with democracy or democratic parties, as we have it in Sweden, as also Henry's comments were circling around. So in this text, or in this article I wrote, I just gave a couple of examples, and we have many of those examples now, I think. But for instance, one example from the US during the Trump regime, where you had actually public servants who opposed the majority elected leader, right? And then in Sweden, we also have a couple of examples now from recent years where public servants actually have opposed the elected party representatives within their municipality. And in opposing them, they have referred to the public ethos and human rights, rather than fleeting or the temporary political opinions by that party. So I'm not going to expand on that more here, but I'm with you on that, but I also would like to tease out, perhaps if we could elaborate a bit further and talk about agents rather than agencies. And then just one last comment here, if I have time for it. But and I also want to connect back to what Henry talked about, that I think that in this, when also in your comments, Paul, I think that for me, what is really like, what we really need to tease out here and discuss a lot more is who, and I think I just mentioned it a bit right now, but who is the subject of those rights? And as Henry said here, you can say that there is a difference between citizen rights, and we have that a lot now in Sweden. We have political voices that say, yeah, we must have stronger citizen rights for elderly, for Swedish citizens, for la 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 la. And we must remember that citizen rights can be opposed, or it's a conundrum between citizen rights and human rights, because we have to define, identify, and that is often, or always, I must say, a kind of political choice we make. Who is the human person here? I just read an excellent book by Patricia Kingston, I think her name is, about who is fully human. And that is the question I think that I grapple a lot with now in this conundrum between citizen rights and human rights. Who is fully human? Who is supposed to be the bearer of the rights in our municipality, or in Sweden as a nation, or on a global level? And there is no one easy solution on that question, to that question. And we can complicate it, or it's not we who complicate, the world is complicated, right? We have persons who are stateless or come from one state to another and not easily get this citizenship with citizen rights, etc. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Great, fantastic, insightful remarks, Helen and Henry as well. Thank you. I would like to just pass the ball to Paul, see if you want to respond to any of what was said by Henry and Helen.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Linda. Look, Linda, I'm in your hands. I'm happy to respond now, or please use your prerogative as chair. If you wish to open it up to discussions to everybody, that's fine too. I'll be guided by you. I'm in your hands. Whatever you think is going to work best.
Yes, exactly. Okay, great. So shoot, I think you can respond for a few minutes, and then we'll open up for a general discussion, including the audience.
Okay. So the points and the questions, the challenges and the commentaries were very, very rich. I can't do them justice, so forgive me in advance. I'm just going to make some brief remarks around a selection of the issues raised. Henry, I'm glad that you went back to the sort of preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And the point that I would like to emphasize, I think we're agreeing with each other, so it's a question of emphasis. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a response to authoritarianism. And it was a response not just to the impacts of authoritarianism, namely anti-Semitism, closing newspapers, etc. It was also a response to the causes of authoritarianism. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's not just a code of civil and political rights. Don't torture, don't close down synagogues, don't close down trade unions. The Universal Declaration doesn't only say that, it also says you have to address the causes of authoritarianism. And that includes issues around social injustice and poverty and unfairness. So that is, for me, it's a really important feature of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It responds to the breaches of civil and political rights. It was response to the causes of fascism and other forms of authoritarianism. Helen, gosh, so many really, really interesting and challenging issues. Look, I'm just going to make a few remarks, and then if needs be, I can elaborate later or whatever. your comment about values. Yeah, I don't have an answer to this. I'm agreeing with you. They're contested. Values shift. Values to a degree are contextual. And this is deeply problematic. This is really problematic, and I don't have a nice answer, nice, neat, easy answer to it. I just think it's the reality that embedded within human rights are a set of values, and those values do shift over time, and human rights has to morph with them without selling out on their essence. Now, don't ask me what their essence is, because I won't be able to tell you. But this is a real conundrum, and I accept it. It is very difficult. Another remark you made about a little bit uncomfortable with the insinuation that human rights are sort of natural. Look, in my humble opinion, human rights are all about the exercise and distribution of power. That's what they're about. They're about, human rights are sites of struggle. And as the values change, human rights change, there are going to be contestation and a struggle around the appropriate understanding of those human rights. So perhaps I overstated the sort of image of living and garden and natural, but when you strip it all back, human rights, in my humble opinion, are about the exercise and distribution, and human rights are always, always, always a fight of struggle. Implementation, and you referred to Eleanor Roosevelt, yes, and she has that nice phrase, doesn't she? She talked about human rights are all about the small places close to home. And it's often quoted, and it's a powerful image, powerful sentence. And it really chimes with what I'm trying to convey, which is human rights are about making an impact on people's everyday lives, you know, in their universities, in their creches, in their kindergartens, in their schools, in their housing estates, wherever, in their health clinics and so forth. So that's the great challenge. And the lawyers can't do that, right? As I often say, if we depend upon lawyers to implement the right to health care, we will all die prematurely. You know, if we wish to operationalize the right to health care and the right to health protection, we need health professionals. The question of who is responsible for implementation of human rights. Look, there's as a matter of the primary duty bearers are states. They're the primary duty bearers. We look to them to deliver. However, what I'm suggesting is that in addition, as individuals and human beings, not as citizens, I'll come to that in a moment, as human beings, we have some responsibilities arising under the human rights. But the primary responsibility and the legal responsibility is on states and other powerful public actors, local government, central government. I would include corporations as well. And that is part of the site of struggle that we're engaged in at the moment, whether or not to extend all human rights and their responsibilities, the responsibilities for human rights to corporations. That's a current contemporary site of struggle. I'll close, I think, by saying that I'd really like to read your article about not integrity agencies, but integrity agents. I need to get my head around that. So if it's possible, please alert me to your article. I'd like to, if it's in English, if it's in a language I could read, it isn't. Well, in that case, maybe we should talk about it sometime, Helen. But my closing remark is about who is the subject, the rights holder of human rights. Well, it's human beings. It's not citizens. It's human beings. It's human beings. Their human rights are universal, meaning they apply to everybody. The duty bearers are all those exercising public power, and the rights holders are all human beings. It's a very cosmopolitan view of the world. I'll stop there, Linda, without having done justice to either Henry's remarks nor Helen.
Okay.
Oh, you did.
Thank you so much. So we have room for a couple of questions from the audience, and I see one hand up here. So is there a volunteer who can, and one up there? Is there a volunteer with a mic who can do a bit of running? Okay, wonderful. So I just remind you to keep your questions as brief as possible.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting discussion. I'm wondering, because as you're talking about, democracy has sort of taken over the agenda, that the human rights are sort of partly a part of, but also next to, or how to say. And one thing that is often the answer is that equality is part of democracy. So if we emphasize equality, we're sort of covering the human rights articles. As I would just like to hear your comments to that, because I think this, I'm myself an editorial writer at a Swedish paper called Arbetet, from the left side of the political sphere. And this is really something that I think we will see this more as the coming elections will raise issues on, well, as you said, citizenship and who has the right to have a good sort of living standard and so forth. So thank you.
So I think I'll direct that question to you, Helen. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah. That question ties directly into what Paul and Henry also talked about. This. Who do we want to consider as fully human? And the egalitarian view, which is, as I think, in democratic theory, it's the basic of democracy, is the idea of strong equality, as I call it. And there we really need to. Do we want to be cosmopolitans and universalists, as Paul here claims he is? That if so, we need to stretch this count of equality to every human being in, for instance, this political entity, Sweden, if we have a kind of Swedish, if we talk about Sweden. And that is a demanding approach, because that will include stateless people, refugees, asylum seekers, etc., etc. But if we really want to embrace this understanding of equality and have this egalitarian view, we have to extend the notion of who is fully human to every human being. And this other political scientist I mentioned, she claimed that, well, we can have one citizenship with rights that is a bit thinner than a member state citizenship that could go deeper than if you are a Swedish citizen. So that is one way of having a solution to that problem. But what those thinner rights could hold, we also need to discuss and agree upon that.
And then there was a question in the way back, I think. Yes.
Very good, thank you. So this is all very interesting, but I'm a bit impatient, because I think the background to this discussion is the attack on the idea of the connection between human rights and democracy. So I think in this forum we are more or less, we agree on the mechanics and theory of that. But so I think the interesting issues would be to be on the attack and not on the defense. So to And that means two things. One, to expose the nonsense, frankly, of many of those attacks on this idea. And secondly, to attend to the, just as Henry says, to the beams in our eyes, so that we are not prone to whataboutism when attacked as a Swedish society, for example. So I would like your comments on that.
I think I'll ask Henry to comment. Is that
Okay. Well, I think we should take that comment and use it. I don't really see the question, but more as a demand for us to be more offensive rather than defensive in our approach.
Yes. Well, I think it's just as a final kind of reflection from the chair. I think it's very interesting to hear all of you, because I think of your interventions here as kind of responses to that question. Because it's easy when human rights and democracy are under attack that we start playing defense. That the human rights movement becomes conservative. That it becomes all about preserving what is. But I think what I hear all of you saying is that we should embrace the fact that human rights are constantly changing values, and they will change because society will change, and that means that the challenges to these values will change. So we have to come up with new responses of what human rights are and could mean for our societies continuously, and I think we can still learn from history, and I think that Henry's intervention was excellent in that regard. That perhaps the crucial thing to kind of take away from the experience of the Universal Declaration and so on was not just exactly the formulas that they reached, but the fact that they had that conversation, that critical reflection on, okay, what values should guide our societies? What are these kind of outer limits of what a decent society looks like? So I think, as you said in the back, I think we need to play offense, and we have to kind of look ahead and keep our back straight and focus on the opportunities rather than just the challenges.
Linda, can I just add a very brief comment? I think we are now in Sweden also heading a situation with the new migration law where a rather large part of our population will consist of people having temporary residence permits for decades, maybe. They will contribute, they will work in the Swedish society, but they will not have a permanent residence permit. They will not have an opportunity to become citizens. They will not have democratic rights like being allowed to vote or to be elected or to take part of the society. And I think in this situation it will be still more important to emphasize human rights, that these people also have rights in our society.
Okay, so I think we need to close shop. The time is over 10 o'clock, which was the end time for the seminar. So thank you so much, Henry and Helen, and thank you so much, Paul, for joining us from New Zealand. So we wish you a good night, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion. So. All right, so I think we can give the panelists a warm-up.
Thank you very much.